The physical reality of negative buoyancy allows for zero negotiation. When a vessel carrying high-density cargo loses its watertight envelope, the ocean reclaims it with absolute mathematical certainty. On the SS Rosecastle, a shattered hull and thousands of tons of high-grade iron ore created a catastrophic downward acceleration. The resulting plunge cost 28 men their lives. The date was November 2, 1942. The SS Rosecastle measured 455 feet in length. Her tonnage appears differently across records. Builder records list 7,546 gross tons, while wartime loss records list about 7,803 tons. She sat anchored, a massive iron structure waiting in the dark. Her cargo holds were loaded with dense iron ore for the wartime route from Wabana toward Sydney. That heavy cargo gave the ship less margin once the hull was open to the sea. The attack was swift and decisive. 2 enemy torpedoes struck the side of the hull. The detonations shattered the exterior steel plating, instantly compromising multiple watertight compartments. The displacement that kept the freighter afloat failed almost instantly, and the sea rushed through the torn compartments. Diver accounts and local histories describe the SS Rosecastle going down in less than 90 seconds after the second hit. Water, oil, and debris would have surged violently around the collapsing hull, leaving almost no time for an organized evacuation. This ruthless geometry of time and weight sealed the fate of the 28 crew members who could not escape the sinking structure. The SS Rosecastle was an armed merchant freighter in a strategically important iron ore trade. Belle Island's high-grade ore was vital to Allied steel production, and German U-boats targeted the anchorage to interrupt that flow. Consequently, the merchant ship carried defensive weapons for a surface threat she could not always see coming. The Belle Island freighters were fitted with 4.75-inch deck guns and carried projectiles and small arms ammunition. When the SS Rosecastle sank, that wartime inventory went down with her, some of it later identified on the wreck and in ammunition lockers beneath gun deck areas. The ship settled hard into the sea floor and remained upright in the cold water of Conception Bay. Her steel hull became both a historic lost site and a dangerous underwater structure, with defensive weapons and ammunition still present on and within the wreck. The ore cargo helped hold the lower hull in place, while decades of corrosion, marine growth, and depth kept the site difficult to work. The ship was down, but the wartime inventory still demanded respect, setting up a decades-long standoff between access and preservation. Operating around the SS Rosecastle means working inside a cold, technical diving envelope. The wreck is generally described as upright and unusually intact for a ship of her age, with the main deck reported around 95 feet and the seabed falling toward 160 feet around the lower hull. Bottom temperature varies with season and depth, but the site remains cold enough to impose hard limits on dexterity, breathing gas, and decompression. Historically, the Wabana anchorage forced loaded ore carriers to wait in exposed waters off Belle Island. Today, that same geography gives divers a confined cold-water battlefield rather than a forgiving open ocean site. Every minute spent at depth carries a cost on the ascent. At 37 degrees Fahrenheit, thermal protection systems are pushed to their limits. Hands lose dexterity, cognition slows under the drain of core heat, and pressure at 160 feet compresses breathing gas while accelerating nitrogen absorption. Work on the main decks is therefore measured in minutes before the ascent schedule takes over. Within those limits, disciplined visual assessments and clearance dives yielded a crucial baseline of structural intelligence. They confirmed the wartime hazard already suspected from the wreck inventory, with publicly reported material including 4.75-inch deck gun rounds, projectiles, small arms ammunition, and items documented in lockers beneath gun deck areas. The evidence proved that the wreck still contained wartime hazards, but it did not require claiming that every round lay exactly where a crewman had placed it. The remaining operational boundary was the wreck's weakened fabric. Dense, soft corals masked degraded deck plates, bulkheads, and primary load-bearing supports, leaving a visually majestic structure that could not absorb heavy shock. That fragility overlapped with preservation, marine life, and memorial concerns. The Belle Island attacks are nationally commemorated in Canada, and the wrecks are treated as solemn historic lost sites. For underwater explosive hazards, in situ destruction can be one option, but at this site, the selected mitigation method avoided explosive energy on the wreck. In 2019, the Royal Canadian Navy launched a disciplined survey and extraction operation built around non-destructive extraction. Instead of applying concussive force, salvage engineers and dive teams separated heavy artillery shells from the weather decks using controlled buoyancy rather than brute force. The physical mechanics of this extraction were precise and unforgiving. The divers located the dormant defensive weapons resting on the upper levels of the ship. They then carefully attached heavy-duty underwater lift bags to the unstable ordnance. These lift bags functioned as temporary adjustable buoyancy modules. By slowly injecting precise volumes of compressed air into the bags, the divers generated just enough upward force to overcome the dead weight of the thick steel casings. This process required perfect physical balance. If a bag was underinflated, the heavy shell would remain pinned to the deck. If it was overinflated, the munition could rocket toward the surface, potentially slipping from its rigging or colliding with the dive support vessels above. The divers had to gently coax the heavy artillery rounds off the rusted deck plates. Once the ordnance achieved neutral buoyancy, the divers carefully guided the lift bags through the water column. They manually escorted the volatile cargo up from the cold depths, ensuring a slow and perfectly controlled ascent. This soft lift technique kept deteriorated munitions from striking the ship's superstructure or jarring against each other during recovery. Over the course of the 2019 deployment, clearance divers removed and destroyed 140 pieces of ordnance from the designated Belle Island shipwreck sites. The SS Rose Castle was part of that operation, but the number belongs to the wreck field collectively, not to one hull alone. The operational restraint extended beyond the water. Once the recovered munitions broke the surface, they were not simply dumped into deeper ocean zones or blown up at sea. The extraction teams meticulously transferred the unstable artifacts onto specialized support vessels. The ordnance was then transported to the shoreline. The final disposal was conducted on land at a remote mainland quarry in Holyrood. This land-based detonation became the mission's operational fingerprint. The final blast occurred away from the wreck field rather than against the hulls and surrounding soft corals. The 2019 phase cleared accessible known ordnance while preserving the wreck structures, but it did not make every upper deck a pristine zero-hazard zone. The remaining chapter lay inside deteriorating steel. In 2021, the operational focus shifted from exposed hazards to ammunition stored inside the Belle Island wrecks. The task was to remove the final known pieces from the hulls of the 4 sunken freighters, including ammunition lockers beneath gun deck areas. This was no longer a simple visual recovery from open steel. It was confined, cold, and slow, with divers working inside decaying spaces where the wreck itself became part of the hazard. The primary evidence remaining within these enclosed spaces consisted of large-caliber defensive ammunition. These rounds were part of the ship's defensive armament intended for use against surfaced U-boats or other raiders rather than as a guaranteed weapon against a submerged pressure hull. The preservation inside the shielded compartments was startling, but the strongest public evidence is more limited. Clearance divers reported ammunition in original shipping containers inside lockers beneath gun deck areas, and none of the ordnance removed in that phase was fused. That finding was crucial. It showed the teams were handling wartime ammunition that had survived inside the wrecks, while avoiding any unsupported claim that investigators could read every manufacturing mark or reconstruct every storage detail. However, retrieving these internal munitions pushed the recovery teams against a severe operational boundary. Inside the lockers, deteriorated steel, rust, debris, and biological growth created a fragile overhead environment. The same corrosion that gave the wreck its ghostly texture also made the working space unstable. The enclosed geometry of the lockers trapped the divers in a tight physical envelope, where even normal movement could destroy visibility. As the operators moved within the narrow steel walls, their standard life support equipment became a direct complication for the mission. Every time a diver exhaled, bubbles rose into the overhead spaces. When those bubbles struck the deckheads, rust and debris could fall into the water column, turning a careful recovery into a near-zero visibility problem. The structural failure of that overhead debris was immediate enough to erase useful sightlines inside the lockers. Visual documentation and mapping became unreliable in the worst pockets of the space. The extraction specialists had to slow the operation down and rely heavily on tactile feedback. Confronted with darkness and suspended debris, the divers worked by touch as much as by sight. They handled the heavy 4.75-inch rounds carefully, freeing them from storage by feel when visibility collapsed. Despite the sensory deprivation, the 2021 operation achieved its mandated goal. Across the 4 Belle Island freighters, the teams removed the final 60 pieces of known ordnance from the wrecks. The main hull was finally stripped of its own internal weapons, but the sea floor outside the physical ship held a completely different kind of threat. A reported torpedo lies roughly 130 feet off the stern area, fundamentally altering how divers understand the underwater sight. While the immediate wreckage of the vessel dominates the sea floor, this separate object extends the battlefield beyond the hull itself. Diver reports describe torpedo remains near the SS Rose Castle, but the public record supports cautious language. It is a reported wartime torpedo artifact, not a publicly verified intact and armed weapon. This detached evidence is valuable, but only within strict limits. The coherent wreckage of the merchant ship proves that the vessel was violently destroyed, while the reported torpedo remains show that the debris field and memory of the attack extend beyond the steel hull. Official histories confirm that U-518 fired torpedoes at oreships off Belle Island and that the Scotia Pier was struck during the attack. They do not, however, publicly prove that the off-hull object represents a complete unexploded miss or a measurable firing spread. The artifact should therefore be treated as hazardous and historically important, but not as a clean mathematical map of the submarine commander's aim. There is a profound operational difference between ammunition stored inside a wreck and a torpedo artifact whose condition cannot be verified from the outside. For documentary purposes, the safest statement is simple. Any torpedo remains on the sea floor must be treated as potentially hazardous unless competent authorities determine otherwise. Its internal state cannot be assumed from appearance alone, and disturbing it would add risk without adding proportional historical value. Therefore, the torpedo remains should stay untouched in the dark. They can be photographed, measured, and plotted from a respectful distance. But the story should avoid turning that caution into a detailed explanation of how the weapon might function. Survey teams can document its existence and location while leaving its core condition undisturbed. With the main wrecks mitigated and the reported off-hull hazard acknowledged, the site reached a safer operational state without pretending every wartime object had been solved. To secure the future of the deep water site, authorities had to execute a precise balancing act, weighing known explosive risk mitigation against preservation of a fragile historic wreck field. The Royal Canadian Navy stated that clearing the hazards would allow the Government of Canada to move toward national historic site protection for the shipwrecks. Parks Canada, meanwhile, identifies the German U-boat attacks at Belle Island as a national historic event. The safer distinction is important. The attacks are formally commemorated, while the wrecks were being prepared for stronger protection through hazard removal. The completion of the methodical clearance operations successfully reduced the central conflict. By strictly adhering to the mandated survey objectives of risk characterization and structural preservation, the military dive teams removed the known ordnance identified for the operation without compromising the historical integrity of the wrecks. Approximately 200 pieces of ammunition were removed and destroyed from the 4 ships across the 2019 and 2021 missions. That was a major safety achievement, but the accurate wording is not pristine zero hazard. It is known explosive hazards mitigated without cutting the wreck apart or detonating the threat against the hull. With the known ordnance removed from the wrecks, the management condition of the site shifted decisively. The Belle Island wrecks are already visited by experienced divers, and the reduction of explosive risk made that access safer. But the public record does not support a special classification called conditionally permitted, nor does it support promising that every interior space is legally open or closed in the exact terms stated here. The defensible rule is simpler. Divers may observe, but they should not disturb, remove, or recover artifacts. Archaeological investigation or artifact recovery in Newfoundland and Labrador requires proper authorization, and past casual recovery from these wrecks is no longer legal. Furthermore, the reported torpedo remains off the wreck maintain a silent warning over the broader area. The primary wrecks were mitigated through ordnance removal, but any off-hull torpedo artifact should still be avoided and left undisturbed unless competent authorities decide otherwise. The management strategy is therefore boundary awareness, restraint, and respect, not total site annihilation. The multi-year operation at the bottom of the bay stands as a profound success when stated within those limits. The survey and mitigation objectives were fulfilled without choosing the easier visual drama of underwater explosive demolition. Through severe operational discipline, the teams removed the immediate known threats by hand, preserved the fragile hulls, and protected the surrounding marine environment from unnecessary shock. The Rose Castle will slowly continue to dissolve into the ocean currents over the coming decades, but it will do so as part of a safer, nationally remembered wreck field rather than as an unstable, forgotten arsenal.